35-degree water, 60-mile-an-hour wind, and a helicopter with fuel for 20 more minutes. This is the Bering Sea, where a wave once swallowed a rescue helicopter whole, where a crab boat vanished in 4 minutes without a single word, where ice can flip a steel ship like a coin. If stories like this grip you, hit like and subscribe. It really helps. Tonight you fly with the crews who go anyway. Hold on. We are going in. At 4 in the morning, a crab boat lost her engine and started drifting toward a cliff she could not see. The boat was the Arctic Sea, 134 feet long, about 4 school buses parked end to end. 9 men were aboard, fishing tana crab in the dead of winter. The wind that night blew near 60 miles an hour. On dry land, that knocks a grown adult off their feet. Out there, it was shoving 10-foot waves and a powerless boat toward rock. The rock was St. George Island, sitting alone in the Bering Sea, about 750 miles west of Anchorage. Fewer than 100 people live on it. From the deck, it would have looked like a shadow swallowing the stars, getting wider every minute. She hit the north shore just after 4. Waves began breaking over her hull. Water came in. Then the boat's fire suppression system dumped on its own, flooding the bridge with chemical fog and forcing the crew out of the only warm room they had. 9 men ended up standing on an open deck in the dark, taking freezing spray in the face. Another fishing boat, the North Sea, was close enough to talk on the radio. She could not come any closer. The water where the Arctic Sea died was too shallow, and going in after her would have made 2 wrecks instead of 1. So the North Sea stayed back and talked and watched. The 9 men pulled on survival suits. They inflated a life raft. They switched on an emergency beacon and let it scream their position up to a satellite. Then they waited. This is the part nobody pictures. There's no rescue base on St. George. There's no hospital helicopter 10 minutes away. The Coast Guard launched a Jayhawk helicopter from Cold Bay, a speck of an airstrip out on the Alaska Peninsula. They launched a Hercules airplane from Kodiak. They turned a cutter called the Alex Haley toward the island and told it to hurry, knowing full well that a ship crosses the ocean at roughly the speed of a bicycle. The helicopter reached them at 11:30 in the morning. Do that math slowly. Those men stood on that deck for about 7 hours. 7 hours of spray, in wind you cannot stand upright in, feeling the boat break apart under your boots. When the Jayhawk finally arrived, the flying got harder instead of easier. Wind slamming into the island's cliff rolled over the top and punched straight down, so the helicopter was fighting invisible hands pressing it toward the water. Holding a steady hover in that is like trying to keep a kite motionless against a wall, while somebody keeps shoving the wall. They did it anyway. A rescue swimmer went down the cable. 9 fishermen came up, all of them, plus the swimmer, in about 25 minutes. Everybody lived. That is exactly why you never heard about it. This happened in January of 2026, and it barely made the news, because out here a story only travels when it ends badly. The pilots who flew it call it luck. The wind could have shifted. The beacon could have failed. The boat could have rolled at hour 3 instead of holding on until hour 7. They talk that way because they know what is underneath them. The storms get all the blame. The floor of the sea deserves half of it. The Bering Sea is enormous, freezing, and shockingly shallow, and that last word is the one that kills people. Spread out a map. The sea covers something like 770,000 square miles, wedged between Alaska and Russia. That is bigger than Alaska and Texas glued together. You would expect a body of water that size to be deep, like the open Pacific. Much of it is not. The eastern side, where almost all the fishing happens, sits on a continental shelf so wide it reaches roughly 300 miles out from the Alaskan coast. It is one of the broadest shelves on the planet, and the average water depth over that shelf is around 200 feet. 200 feet. The Statue of Liberty, from the ground to the tip of her torch, is about 305 feet. Stand her on that seafloor, and her whole upper body would be dry. Here's why that matters, and it is pure physics. In deep ocean, a big wave is long and lazy. The energy spreads down through thousands of feet of water below it, so what reaches the surface is a rolling hill. A ship climbs it and slides down the back. Sailors hate it, but they survive it. Now take that same energy and slide a floor underneath it. The wave feels the bottom. It slows down. The energy has nowhere left to go except up. The wave shortens, steepens, and stands on end. Think of a skateboard ramp. Roll along flat concrete and nothing happens. Hit the curve and you get launched because the shape of the ground turns your speed into height. The Bering Shelf does that to the entire ocean, everywhere, all winter. So a fishing captain out there is fighting waves that are short, steep, and stacked close together. They do not roll under a boat. They arrive like a moving wall. Then the next one arrives before the boat has finished recovering from the last. The sea starts hitting like a hammer instead of pushing like a hand. Buoys around the Aleutian chain have measured waves over 30 feet. In January of 2026, satellites clocked seas south of the islands over 40 feet. 40 feet is a 4-story building, moving in the dark, aimed at you. Then the sea makes it stranger. The floor is not flat everywhere. Cut into that shelf are some of the largest underwater canyons on Earth, including one that is the biggest in the world by volume. Water shoved over a canyon rim behaves like wind rolling over a mountain ridge. It twists, it speeds up, it builds eddies that can span hundreds of miles and last for months. The result is a sea state that stops making sense. Waves stop lining up in neat rows and start crossing each other, arriving from two directions at once. Where two of those crossing waves meet, they briefly add together, and something appears that should not exist for its wind speed. A single steep monster in an otherwise ordinary storm. For a rescue pilot, this is the nightmare inside the nightmare. You can plan around forecast waves. You cannot plan around one wave that shows up alone, so the floor loads the gun. The next question is who keeps pulling the trigger, and the answer is a machine parked permanently over the Aleutians, one of the largest weather features in the entire northern hemisphere. There's a storm factory sitting over these islands, and it almost never closes. Meteorologists call it the Aleutian Low. That name sounds boring, and it hides something huge. It is a semi-permanent zone of low air pressure that parks near the Aleutian Islands every winter and stays there. It is one of the main engines of atmospheric circulation across the top half of the planet. Low pressure means rising air. Rising air means clouds, wind, and rotation. So imagine a permanent drain in the sky, and every storm in the North Pacific gets pulled toward it. Here is where those storms are born, and the recipe is almost cruel. Far away, off the coast of Japan, freezing dry air pours off Siberia and runs straight out over the Kuroshio, a warm ocean current. Cold air over warm water is the same setup that builds thunderstorms, except this happens across hundreds of miles at once. The air soaks up heat and moisture, lifts, and starts to spin. The storm deepens fast, sometimes ferociously fast. Then the jet stream picks it up and throws it northeast across thousands of miles of open Pacific and delivers it to the Bering Sea fully grown. Weather forecasters measure a storm's strength by how low its pressure drops. A garden variety storm might sit near 1000 millibars. Serious hurricanes drop below 950. In November of 2014, a storm arrived in the Bering Sea that forecasters estimated near 924 millibars. That put it among the 5 deepest low pressure systems ever recorded in the North Pacific, and it was never a hurricane at all. It was just a winter storm that got out of hand. The National Weather Service issued a hurricane force wind warning for the western Aleutians. Sustained winds were forecast around 80 miles an hour. Not gusts, sustained. A buoy about 250 miles from Dutch Harbor measured waves over 30 feet. And this happens on a schedule. Storms line up like planes waiting for a runway. One passes, the sea barely settles, and the next low is already spinning up behind it. Crews out there describe going days without a truly calm hour. Then, in summer, the whole thing nearly vanishes. The Aleutian Low weakens and fades. The Bering Sea can turn glassy and grey and almost gentle. Tourists on ferries see whales and think it looks peaceful. That seasonal switch is the trap. The fish and the money are in the water during the worst months. Snow crab season runs through the dark of winter. Cod seasons, the same. The fleet is out there precisely when the factory is running at full speed, because that is when the animals are there and when the buyers are waiting. So the Coast Guard's flying season and the storm season are the exact same season. There's no version of this where rescue crews get the calm months. Ask any Kodiak pilot what they fear and they will not say, the average storm. They train for the average storm. They fear the outlier, the one the models underestimate. The day the numbers on the forecast turn out to be politely wrong. Because that has already happened, and the record for what this place can do is worse than most people would believe. One gust here still holds a number that sounds made up. On a scrap of island closer to Russia than to mainland Alaska, a wind gauge once recorded a gust of 159 miles an hour. The island is Attu, the far western tip of the Aleutian chain. The date was December the 7th, 1950. That number is still the strongest gust ever measured in Alaska. Sit with the size of it. A Category 5 hurricane, the highest rating that exists, starts at 157 miles an hour. Attu beat the worst hurricane category with a gust in December, in a place that was never called a hurricane at all. A few weeks later, in February of 1951, a gauge at Kotzebue clocked a sustained wind of 93 miles an hour. Sustained means it held. That was not a spike or a freak burst. That was the wind simply deciding to blow that hard, minute after minute. These are old records, and old records make people relax. They shouldn't. In November of 2011, a storm crossed the Pacific and reorganized itself over the Bering Sea. It had started life as a typhoon in the western Pacific. It weakened, fell apart, and should have faded into grey drizzle. Instead, it drifted into the Aleutian Low, found the same cold air and warm water recipe waiting for it, and came back to life stronger than before. Storms do that here. They get second chances. Nome felt what these systems do to a coastline. In November of 1974, a Bering Sea storm shoved water 13 feet above normal into the town. 13 feet of extra ocean, arriving where a street used to be. That is a 2-story wall of sea moving inland. Now put a boat in the middle of that. A fishing boat does not get to pull over. There's no shoulder. When a wind like that arrives, the crew is standing on a moving steel deck in the dark, in the cold, and the wind is loud enough that a man screaming 3 feet away is a mime. Rescue pilots study these records the way a climber studies avalanche reports. They do not fly in 150-mile-an-hour wind. Nobody does. What matters is what the records prove about the ceiling. This place is capable of things that no forecast model wants to predict, and a model that will not predict something cannot warn you about it. So the crews plan for the storm the computer describes, and then they leave room in their heads for the storm the computer missed. That gap is where people die. Here's the strange part, and the part that makes veterans of this coast go quiet. The record wind is not what worries them most. Wind alone is survivable. Boats have ridden out 90-mile-an-hour gales and limped home with the paint scoured off. What worries them is what the wind does to the water when it has room to run, because a gust lasts seconds. And out here, the wind gets days. Days of pushing in one direction across an open plain of ocean the size of a continent with nothing anywhere to break it up. No island big enough, no headland, no coast until Alaska. That is a runway, and the sea uses every inch of it. Wind does not build a wave with one shove. It builds a wave the way a bully builds a bruise, by hitting the same spot over and over. Waves need 3 things to grow: wind speed, wind duration, and distance, which sailors call fetch. Fetch is the runway. It is how far the wind can blow across open water without hitting anything. Blow across a bathtub and you get ripples, because the wind runs out of tub. Blow across a lake and you get chop. Blow across 1,000 miles of open ocean and you get something with a personality. Between the Russian coast and Alaska, the Bering Sea gives the wind more than 1,000 miles of clean runway. The Aleutian Islands sit at the southern edge like a fence made of gravel, and they stop almost nothing. So the wind pushes and the water piles and the waves feed on themselves. Small waves catch bigger waves and merge. The whole surface climbs. Then the sea plays its worst card. Sometimes the storm stops moving. On April 26, 2026, forecasters watched a hurricane-force low roll toward the Aleutians and predicted it would go nearly stationary for a full day. Winds of 58 to 75 miles an hour would sit within roughly 200 miles of the center. Seas were forecast at 23 to 33 feet, holding in the same place for 24 hours. A moving storm punches you and leaves. A stalled storm leans on you. Now add the shape of the wave. Scientists studying this region track something called wave steepness, which is height compared to length. A tall wave that is also long is a hill. A tall wave that is short is a cliff. The Bering Sea specializes in cliffs because that shallow floor keeps squeezing the length out of every wave that crosses it. Steep waves break. Breaking waves do not lift a boat. They collapse onto it, dumping tons of water onto the deck all at once. And there's one more trick, the one that makes veterans check the horizon behind them. Storms rotate. As a low spins past, the wind direction swings. The old waves keep traveling in the old direction out of pure momentum, while brand new waves start marching in from the new direction. Now you have 2 wave trains crossing at an angle. Most of the time, they just make a mess. Sometimes, for a moment, a crest from one train lands exactly on a crest from the other, and they add together. A single wave appears that is far bigger than anything the wind that day should be able to make. It exists for a few seconds, and then it is gone. Ask a captain what they fear, and they will not describe a storm. They will describe one wave arriving from the wrong side, in the dark. That is the sea these crews work in, steep, crossed, cold, and occasionally dishonest. which brings up the question everyone eventually asks about the Bering Sea, usually while looking at photos and feeling safe. If you went in, how long would you have? The answer is not measured in hours, it is measured with a stopwatch. The night the Alaska Ranger went down, a rescue swimmer measured the water at 35 degrees. 35 degrees sounds survivable. On a 35-degree morning, you wear a hoodie and complain. That instinct will kill you, because water is not air. Water pulls heat out of a body about 25 times faster than air at the same temperature. Your skin cannot tell the difference. Your core can. In 35-degree water, your body is being drained the way a phone dies when you leave every app running. Survival experts teach a rule of thumb called 1-10-1. It is not a promise, it is a rough map of how you fall apart. 1 minute. The moment you hit the water, your body panics. It is called cold shock. Your chest slams open in a huge involuntary gasp. Then you hyperventilate, breathing fast and shallow with no control at all. If your face is underwater during that gasp, you inhale the ocean. Not eventually, immediately. This is the part almost nobody knows. Most cold water deaths are not hypothermia. They happen in the first 3 minutes and the cause is drowning. Strong swimmers die here. Fitness does not save you because your lungs stop taking orders. 10 minutes. If you survive the gasp, you get roughly 10 minutes of useful movement. Your body starts pulling blood back from your arms and legs to protect your heart and brain. Your hands go first, then your forearms. You can see your fingers. You cannot make them close. That matters more than it sounds. 10 minutes is how long you have to reach a raft, hold a cable, or climb into a rescue basket while it swings. After that, a man can be fully conscious, fully aware, staring at a metal basket 2 feet away, and completely unable to grab it. 1 hour. That is roughly how long before you slide into unconsciousness. Not death, unconsciousness. You go quiet with your head slumped forward, and then the water finishes it. There are charts for all of this, printed on laminated cards. Safety researchers warn that the charts lie by accident. They model hypothermia only. They assume you did not drown in the first minute, that the water is calm, that you are floating politely, that nothing is breaking over your head. Out here everything is breaking over your head, so run the numbers on the whole system. Your body gives you minutes. The nearest rescue helicopter is stationed hundreds of miles away, and it flies at roughly the speed of a car on a freeway, straight into the same wind that is trying to drown you. Minutes on one side, hours on the other. That gap is the entire tragedy of the Bering Sea, written in one line. There's only one thing standing in that gap. Not the helicopter. The helicopter is too far away to matter yet. It is a bright orange suit that looks like a Halloween costume, hanging on a hook by the door, that every fisherman is supposed to be able to put on in under 60 seconds in total darkness. It has a nickname. The men who wear it are not gentle about it, and when it works, it turns those minutes into hours. When it does not work, it turns into a bag. David Hull was asleep in his sweats when the alarm went off, and about 20 minutes later he was trying to shove those same sweats into a survival suit 2 sizes too big. The suits are called gummy suits, and one look explains it. Thick red or orange neoprene, hood, built-in boots, built-in mittens, a zipper up the front. A grown man in one moves like a cartoon. Fishermen make fun of them constantly, right up until they need one. Here is what the suit actually does, and it is clever. It is not trying to keep you dry, exactly. It seals at the neck, traps a thin layer of water against your skin, and lets your body heat that layer up. Then the foam stops the ocean from stealing that layer back. The suit also floats you and covers your head, which protects the 2 places you lose heat fastest. A sealed suit turns a stopwatch into a clock. Minutes become an hour becomes 2. Now here's the honest part, and this is what the Coast Guard tells people who ask. Even with the suit sealed correctly, few people survive in the Bering Sea past about 2 hours. 2 hours is the ceiling. That is the best case, the perfect fit, the perfect seal, on a person who did everything right in the dark while their boat rolled. And almost nobody gets the perfect version. Hull felt the problem right away. The suit was oversized. His feet swam inside the flopping legs, and as he pushed down into it, he felt his thermal socks soak through before he was even in the water. Every gap is a leak. Every leak is a flush of 35-degree ocean cycling through the suit, carrying your heat away with it, over and over, all night. The neck seal is the whole game. If that zipper does not close all the way, waves shove water down your collar. Your suit stops being insulation and becomes a bag you're floating inside. Then there are the mittens. They keep your hands alive, and they also make your hands useless. Try clipping a carabiner while wearing oven mitts on a roller coaster with your eyes closed. That is a hoist. And the suit does nothing about the waves. Your face is a few inches above the water. Every crest fills your hood, your mouth, your eyes. You spend the entire time coughing salt water and being spun. which is why the drills matter so much. Fishermen practice pulling these on in under a minute in the dark, because the actual moment always comes at 2 in the morning with alarm screaming and the deck tilting and no lights. The suit does not save you. Let that land properly. The suit buys time for somebody else to save you. So everything, all of it, comes down to one question. How fast can the somebody else get there? And the somebody else lives on an island most Americans could not point to on a map, guarding a patch of the planet so large the number stops meaning anything. Every rescue in the Bering Sea starts at a single air station on an island in the Gulf of Alaska, and that station guards about 4 million square miles. Read that again slowly. The entire continental United States, from California to Maine, is roughly 3 million square miles. Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak covers more area than that. The Gulf of Alaska, Bristol Bay, the Bering Sea, Alaska's whole Pacific coast. One station, now count the aircraft, about 15, 6 Jayhawk helicopters, 4 smaller Dolphin helicopters, 5 Hercules airplanes, 15 aircraft, 4 million square miles, most of it water, and nearly all of that water cold enough to kill you inside an hour. Try to picture the coverage. Imagine handling every emergency between Los Angeles and New York with 6 helicopters, and then imagine that 90% of the ground in between is freezing ocean with no roads, no towns, and nowhere to set down if something breaks. The distances stop sounding like distances and start sounding like typos. Dutch Harbor, the main fishing port out on the Aleutian chain, sits about 600 miles from Kodiak. Barrow, up on the Arctic coast, is nearly 1,000 miles the other way. Both are Kodiak's problem. Crews there describe it plainly. You come in for a duty shift and you might not be home for a week because you get launched on something wild down at Dutch Harbor or up on the North Slope, and getting back is its own expedition. This is why Kodiak does not take rookies. Pilots arriving there are already qualified aircraft commanders, which means they have been trusted with a helicopter and other people's lives somewhere else first. Then, on arrival, they have to complete an entire additional Alaska syllabus before they are allowed to command a flight here. Think about what that says. The Coast Guard looks at an experienced pilot, someone who has done real rescues, and says, "Not yet, not here. This place is different." Because it is different. The mountains make their own weather. The wind pours off cliffs and punches straight down. The fog can close an airport in 10 minutes. There are stretches where the nearest alternate runway is 2 hours away. And if the weather closes behind you, you have nowhere to go but the water. Everything else in this story is about the sea trying to kill fishermen. This part is about geography trying to kill the rescuers. And here is the trap inside all of it. You would think the limit on saving people out here is courage. It is not. Nobody in this story runs out of courage. Read every account and you find the opposite, people volunteering to stay in freezing water so somebody else fits in the cabin. The limit is smaller and colder than that. It is a number on a gauge, and it counts down whether anyone is still alive underneath you or not. Every single rescue in the Bering Sea is really a subtraction problem, and the arithmetic is brutal. A helicopter can only fly as far as it can fly back, and that one sentence has ended more rescues than any storm. The Jayhawk is a big machine. It looks like it could go anywhere. Its practical limit for an overwater rescue is about 225 nautical miles from where it started. That number is not about the engine. It is about what a rescue actually requires. Fuel out, fuel back. A legal reserve so a fog bank at home does not kill everyone. And then the peace civilians forget entirely. Time on station. Time on station is the whole point. You have to arrive and then hover. Hovering is the hungriest thing a helicopter does, because it is holding its own weight up on pure engine power with no forward lift helping. Then you search, which is more hovering. Then you hoist, which is more hovering. Once per person. 10 people into water means 10 cycles. Each cycle burns gas, so the crew is spending fuel to save lives, and every life costs fuel, and when the number hits the floor, they have to leave. They have a word for that number. Bingo fuel. It is the moment you turn for home or you do not get home. It is not a suggestion or a judgment call. It is math, and math does not care who is still down there blinking a strobe at you. Now put the ring on a map. 225 miles from Kodiak. The crab fleet fishes far outside it. The Alaska Ranger's Mayday came from a point roughly 800 miles west of Kodiak. That is more than 3 times the ring. For the men on the water, it means the cavalry may simply not be able to reach them. Not will not, cannot. The extremes get almost absurd. In January of 2023, a crew forward deployed at Cold Bay got word that a sailor aboard a tanker had broken both of his legs. The ship was about 660 nautical miles south of Dutch Harbor. Dutch Harbor itself was about 155 miles from where the helicopter sat. Added up, the patient was several times farther away than a Jayhawk can rescue. The case turned into a multi-day operation, coordinating with the ship to steam towards them, hunting hangar space, waiting on weather, doing everything except the one thing everyone wanted, which was to go get him right now. Picture a lifeguard on a beach watching someone struggle a mile out who must save half of every breath for the swim back. That is the job. So the crews did the only thing left. If you cannot make the helicopter fly farther, you move where the helicopter starts. It sounds simple. It is not simple at all. It means loading a helicopter's entire life, tools, fuel gear, mechanics, spare parts onto cargo planes and flying all of it to a gravel airstrip in the middle of the Bering Sea, where the nearest hardware store is a plane ride away, and the wind tries to remove your building. They do it every single winter, and the reason they have to keep moving is that the fish are moving too. Every autumn, the Coast Guard packs up a helicopter and flies it to the edge of nowhere. Because 100 fewer miles is the difference between a rescue and a recovery, they call these forward operating locations. Two names matter: Cold Bay, on the Alaska Peninsula, and St. Paul, a small island out in the Bering Sea itself. The idea is stupidly simple and enormously hard. Instead of building a faster fire truck, move the fire station closer to the fires. A single Jayhawk goes out with air crews rotating through on 2-week shifts, one helicopter. That is the whole force. Kodiak keeps its own crews ready behind them for the long, complicated cases, and a cutter with a small Dolphin helicopter on the back patrols the region all season. Officers at Kodiak say it flatly. Cutting the transit time to reach the Bering Sea and the far Aleutians can be the difference between life and death. That is not a slogan. That is the 1:10 clock from earlier, and every mile you remove is a minute you hand back to a man in the water. The logistics are punishing. When they reopened St. Paul mid-season in 2019, it took 15 Hercules cargo flights and more than 90 hours of flying just to carry the gear out. St. Paul had sat unused since 2014. They reopened it because the fishing fleet had moved north, chasing the crab, past the useful reach of Cold Bay. Then there is the cold itself, which attacks the aircraft. Crews will tell you that leaving a helicopter outside in an Alaskan winter turns it into a popsicle you will not fly again for months. Ice in the wrong places, locks up moving parts and hides cracks. So the first job on arriving at a tiny town is finding hangar space, which nobody owes you. There's something almost funny in it. These are the people who fly into hurricane force wind to pull strangers out of the ocean, and their opening move in a new town is to knock on doors and politely ask if anyone would mind moving their airplane out of the way. Alaskans usually say yes. Pilots mention this with real affection. Does it work? Look at one season. Through a 3-month stretch in 2018 and 19 with those deployed crews, cutters, and helicopters working the Bering Sea, they ran 24 search and rescue cases, flew more than 114 hours of it, saved 19 lives, and assisted 29 more people. 19 people are alive because somebody moved a helicopter closer, and through all of this, one question keeps nagging. Why is anyone out there in February at all? Nobody is forced onto that water. There's no draft. These are ordinary guys, many of them in their 20s, choosing to sail into the worst weather in North America in the darkest month of the year. The answer is not stubbornness or thrill-seeking. The answer is a calendar, a bank, and a plant that closes on a date. A few weeks before he died, a crewman texted his father a sentence that explains the entire fishery. He said he had not slept in days. To understand why anyone sails into a Bering Sea winter, forget the weather and look at the paperwork. Dutch Harbor, out on Unalaska Island, is one of the biggest fishing ports in America. Boats leave from there to catch cod, pollock, and crab. Snow crab season runs through the dark months, because that is when the crab are catchable and when the market pays. Now add the rules. The fleet works under a quota system. Each boat gets a share, measured in pounds, and that is your year. Miss it, and the money is simply gone, and the loan on a $15 million boat does not pause out of sympathy. Now add the processors. A crab boat catching crab is only half the job. Somewhere on shore, a plant has to take delivery. Those plants close on set dates when the season ends, and they do not wait for your weather to improve. Put it together with a real example. The destination had to deliver about 191,000 pounds of crab. The plant on St. Paul was scheduled to shut down for the season between February 20th and 25th. The boat had gotten a late start because it had been fishing cod first, and cod also has deadlines. So the crew configured 190 of their 200 pots from cod gear to crab gear and went, in February, into the Bering Sea. That is what the pressure looks like. Not a captain being reckless, A captain looking at a calendar he did not write, a quota he did not set, and a plant closing on a date decided in an office. Imagine being told your final exam happens once, on one specific day, and that day happens to be during a hurricane, and skipping it costs you a year's income and possibly your boat. The results are exactly what you would expect. Commercial fishing is one of the deadliest jobs in the United States. In 2019, it was the deadliest, ranked above everything else. Federal investigators estimate the fatality rate at roughly 35 times that of the average American worker. More than 40 fishermen die in a typical year. 35 times. If your school has 1,000 students, that is the difference between a hallway and a battlefield. And the industry is not small. It supports more than 700,000 jobs and contributes over $50 billion to the economy. The crab on a restaurant menu, the fish sticks in a freezer aisle, the pollock in a fast food sandwich. Somebody stood on an ice deck in the dark for that. One safety official put it simply: these workers feed all of us, and they deserve better. Now here's what makes this fishery different from every other dangerous job in America. A logger fears the tree, a miner fears the roof. A fisherman in the Bering Sea fears something with no weight and no sound, that arrives on a night when the waves are only 8 feet and the wind is only 30, on a boat that feels completely fine. It comes in on the spray, and it never stops coming. The wind tears the top off a wave, throws it at your boat, and by the time it lands, it is not water anymore. This is freezing spray, and it is the quiet assassin of the Bering Sea. The setup is almost boring. Air well below freezing, ocean water near freezing, wind hard enough to rip spray off the wave tops and fling it downwind in sheets. Each droplet slams into steel and rigging that are already colder than ice, and it freezes on contact. Then the next sheet arrives, and the next. Every few seconds, all night. The rates are measured, and they are ugly. Crews working near St. George Island have reported ice building at roughly a quarter inch to a full inch per hour. Forecasters call anything above about 1.6 inches per hour extreme. The Scandis Rose likely faced that extreme category during her final 2 hours. An inch an hour sounds harmless. Do the arithmetic across an entire boat. Every rail, every cable, every antenna, every flat surface, all growing an inch of ice every hour, for 20 hours. The fight looks medieval. Crews go out on a pitching, black, ice-slicked deck and beat their own boat with sledgehammers and baseball bats. They swing until their shoulders quit, then trade off. The Polar Sea, working near St. George on the same day the destination vanished, stopped 4 separate times just to break ice. Her crew rated the icing an 8 out of 10, and one man described the whole crew as wrecked. There are ways to slow it. Cut your speed, because a slower boat throws less spray. Change your heading, so the wind hits differently. Hide behind an island in the calm patch called the lee. Sail with fewer pots. Throw tops over the stacks, so there's less surface for ice to grab. Every one of those costs time. Time is the quota. Time is the plant closing. Here's what makes this thing genuinely cruel, though. You cannot feel it happening. A wave you can feel. A gale you can hear. Ice arrives with no sensation at all. Nothing lurches. Nothing bangs. The boat just gets a little heavier, a little slower to sit back up after each roll, and a little lower in the water. If you are inside the warm bridge at 3 in the morning, staring at instruments, the whole disaster is happening on the other side of a window that is itself frozen over. That detail is real, and it is horrible. On the Scandis Rose, only 2 of the bridge windows had heaters. The rest iced up, so the crew was estimating how much ice was on that boat by squinting through a couple of clear patches into total darkness. Think of snow on a roof. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. Then the roof is on the floor, but the weight is not really the problem. A boat can carry astonishing weight, loaded with fish, loaded with fuel, loaded with gear, and it sits lower and keeps going all day long. What kills a boat is not how much ice, it is where the ice decides to sit. Weight low in a boat keeps it alive. Weight high in a boat kills it. That is nearly the whole science of the sea in 2 sentences. You already know this. Think of those inflatable punching bag toys with sand in the bottom. Hit it, and it snaps upright every time, because the heavy part wants to be at the bottom. Now pour that sand into the toy's head. Push it once, it stays down. Naval engineers call the snapback riding arm. Every boat has one, and it is the only reason your boat comes back up after a wave shoves it over. Ice destroys it, because of where ice lands. Spray does not settle politely in the bilge. It lands on the highest, most exposed surfaces first. Masts, antennas, rigging, rails, and most of all, the stacks of crab pots piled across the deck. Crab pots are the perfect ice trap, and this is the detail that turns the whole story. A pot is a steel frame wrapped in mesh, roughly 7 feet high, and they get stacked 5 tiers deep on deck. Mesh means surface area, enormous, endless surface area, thousands of tiny strands, each one growing ice on every side. Ice does not coat a pot, it fills it. Investigators found ice filling in the mesh like grout inside and out until a cage becomes a solid block. Now stack 40 of those blocks, 5 high, above the deck. The rulebook could not keep up. Every boat carries stability instructions, a booklet telling the captain how to load it safely. Those instructions assume a certain amount of ice. There was no good guidance at all for how to calculate ice on crab pots, even though crab pots are the single greediest ice collector on the boat. The numbers from the destination are hard to read. Her booklet listed pots at 700 pounds each. After the wreck was found, the Coast Guard pulled one up. It weighed about 140 pounds more than the book said. Multiply by 200 pots. That is 28,000 pounds nobody knew about before a single flake of ice. Her bait limit was just over 6,000 pounds. Shore receipts suggested she left with close to 20,000. In total, that boat was carrying more than 45,000 pounds beyond her stability load. Ice not included. 45,000 pounds is about 7 pickup trucks she was never designed to hold. Then the wind adds its signature move. Wind comes from one side, so ice builds on one side. Now the boat is top heavy and leaning. Sailors call it asymmetric icing, and it is the difference between a boat that is struggling and a boat that has already lost and does not know it. The Scandi's Rose developed a 20-degree list to starboard as she iced. 20 degrees is standing on a wheelchair ramp that never levels out, for hours, while carrying a boat's worth of ice on your shoulders. This is what the Coast Guard's own engineers modeled afterward. With about 8 inches of ice, a boat like the Destination would have had essentially no riding ability left at all. The punching bag toy with sand in its head. Which brings us to a Saturday morning, 6:10 in the morning, on February 11th, 2017. A boat rounded a point of land, left the calm behind an island, and had about 4 minutes left. At 6:10 in the morning, the Destination came around a headland on St. George Island, and by 6:14 she no longer existed. She was 110 feet long, with 6 men aboard and about 200 crab pots stacked on her deck, running for St. Paul and the start of snow crab season. Her crew had more than 70 years of fishing experience between them. These were not amateurs. Before leaving Dutch Harbor, her captain called the Coast Guard on the radio to report their plans. The Coast Guard offered a stability and safety check. 15 minutes. A quick look to confirm the pot count matched the booklet. He declined. He said if it was not required, he did not want one. That 15 minutes is a splinter that never comes out of this story. The forecast that night warned of heavy freezing spray. Other captains listened. The Silver Spray decided to hold up at St. George until it passed. A long liner working nearby watched several boats sitting in a bay on the island, hiding from the weather, anchoring, waiting, beating ice, doing the boring safe thing. The Destination's tracking signal shows what she did instead. She kept going, steady at about 9 knots hour after hour. Investigators later estimated she was exposed to icing conditions for the final 23 hours of her voyage. For the last part of that run, she was sheltered. St. George Island blocked the wind and knocked down the seas, giving her a calm lane. So for a while, the ice slowed down and the ride was easy. Then she rounded Danway Point and left the lee. Everything hit at once. Northeast winds of 20 to 30 knots, seas of 8 to 14 feet. And she came out of that corner already loaded, already top heavy, already leaning. The tracking data reads like a heart monitor of flatlining. Over about 3 minutes, her heading swung 256 degrees to starboard. That is not a turn. That is a boat rolling and being spun by the sea. Her speed fell below 2 knots, slower than walking. Then the signal stopped. No mayday, not one word. 6 experienced men with a working radio, and the sea gave them no time to reach for it. Her emergency beacon popped free and started calling on its own. The whole event, from ordinary to gone, took about 4 minutes. That is the length of a song. The Coast Guard searched. They found a debris field. They found a sheen of oil on the water. They found life rings printed with her name, floating alone. They never found a single crew member, not one. 6 men vanished into 3 miles of water off an island where fewer than 100 people live. Investigators later interviewed nearly 50 people trying to piece together what happened, and one of them said the only honest thing available. Whatever happened, happened very fast, and there is nobody left to tell the story. For months, that was all anybody had. A guess, an oil sheen, and 6 empty chairs in Seattle. The boat itself was somewhere on the bottom of the Bering Sea, and the ocean is very good at keeping things. Finding her would take sonar, 2 research ships, and most of a summer, and what she showed them, lying on her side in the dark, matched the number so large that it sounds like a mistake. That summer, 2 research ships went hunting for a needle in the largest haystack in America. The Coast Guard called in its most rigorous investigators, and 2 vessels from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration joined the search. One, the Oscar Dyson, narrowed the field. The other, the Fairweather, carried advanced sonar that maps the seafloor by sweeping it with sound and listening to what bounces back. It worked. They found her northwest of St. George, sitting in about 256 feet of water, lying on her port side. A remotely operated robot went down with cameras. What came back up were photographs of a boat that had rolled over and dropped straight to the bottom, still stacked with her pots. Then the researchers ran the simulation, and the number stopped everyone. A team at a Canadian university modeled how much ice she would have built up given the weather she sailed through. Their estimate, somewhere between roughly 200,000 and 340,000 pounds of ice on her exposed surfaces by the time she capsized. At the peak, she was gaining about 6,000 pounds of ice every 15 minutes. 6,000 pounds every 15 minutes. That is a car, arriving on your roof 4 times an hour, all night. And the top of that range, 340,000 pounds, is roughly the weight of an adult blue whale, the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth. She was carrying a blue whale made of ice, stacked above her deck in the dark, and nobody aboard could see it happening. The Coast Guard's own engineers ran a separate model using a computer-built hull. Their conclusion matched. Prolonged icing added enough weight high on the boat that her freeboard dropped, and her riding ability collapsed. When she left the shelter of the island and hit real wind and real seas, there was nothing left to bring her back. Federal investigators named the probable cause the captain's decision to keep going through heavy freezing spray without making sure his boat could survive the ice, and without taking the steps that would have limited it. That is the official answer. It is also unsatisfying, and the investigators knew it, because this crew knew about ice. The captain had spent years dealing with it. His men had decades. Investigators openly admitted they could not determine why more ice was not beaten off. There's no way to know what those men were thinking, because there were no survivors, no witnesses, and no final call. What the evidence did show was pressure, a late start, a closing plant, a delivery number to hit, and exhaustion, everywhere, the kind that turns a hard decision into a decision you postpone. That was 2017. The fleet called it a wake-up call. Around 50 boats volunteered for safety checks at the next year. That winter, nobody died. Then came New Year's Eve, 2019. Same sea, same ice, same clock. Only this time, 2 men lived. While most of the country was watching a ball drop, a crab boat named Scandies Rose left Kodiak and pointed herself at the Bering Sea. She was 130 feet long, with 7 men aboard and crab pots stacked on deck. The captain was Gary Coben Jr. His son David was in the crew. The ice started early. By 2 in the morning, spray was already freezing onto the boat. The men rotated hour-long watches on the bridge, and between watches they walked the engine room checking machinery, the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary run. They tried to judge the ice from inside. Only 2 bridge windows had heaters, so those were the only 2 you could see through. Through those patches, a deckhand watched an inch of ice fill in the mesh of the forward pots and coat the rails. The weather kept building. Later, the captain reported measuring winds of 60 to 70 knots, which is roughly 70 to 80 miles an hour. A rescue helicopter would later see 30-foot waves near Sotwick Island. By evening, the boat had developed a 20-degree list to starboard. She was leaning and staying leaned, which is a boat telling you it has lost its balance. Around 9:45 at night, Coben turned about 50 degrees to starboard, running for the shelter of a bay on the southern side of Sotwick Island. It was a reasonable move. Get in the lee, get out of the spray, beat the ice off, wait it out. That turn put the wind and the seas on her weak side. Around that same time, another captain spoke with him on the phone and said afterward that he had never heard that level of stress in the man's voice before. 10 minutes later, the Mayday went out with a position. Then she went over. 2 men were outside on deck when it happened, and the sea simply took them off the boat. From the water, they watched the Scandies Rose sink. They saw nobody else come out. They found a life raft in the dark and got into it. The Coast Guard reached them hours later. They were treated for hypothermia and released. 5 men were never found. Gary Coben Jr., his son David, and 3 crewmen named Seth Rousseau-Garneau, Arthur Ganasius, and Brock Rainey. Months later, the Coast Guard sent a letter of presumed death to an attorney for the families. 2 details from that night still make safety officials angry. The boat had an emergency beacon aboard. After the capsize, no signal was ever received. Neither the survivor remembered seeing it as they went into the water, and no man on that boat had a personal locator beacon, a small device you clip to your own body. that calls for help wherever you are. Regulations did not require them. They still did not require them. There's one more line to this story that has nothing to do with the sea. John Lawler, one of the two survivors, died in a motorcycle accident in October of 2021 that left Dean Gribble Jr. as the only living person who was aboard the Scandies Rose that night. The investigation that followed found something that changed how pilots think about this coast. The forecast for that night had been correct, and it had also been completely, dangerously wrong. The weather forecast the night the Scandies Rose sank was accurate. It was also useless, and both of those things are true at the same time. Here's how that works. The National Weather Service had forecast gale force conditions for that area. When investigators checked the weather observation sites afterward, the readings matched the forecast almost exactly. The system did its job. Then look at what was actually happening on the boat. The captain measured winds of 60 to 70 knots. A helicopter crew, arriving to search, reported 30-foot waves near Sudwick Island. That is far past a gale. That is a different category of night. So the forecast was right about the region and catastrophically wrong about the 1 square of ocean where 7 men were. The reason is almost embarrassing. The nearest weather station was more than 100 miles from where she went down. 100 miles. That is like forecasting the weather for New York City using a thermometer in Philadelphia, then acting surprised when it snows. Mariners told investigators what forecasters could not see. The area around Sudwick Island was notorious. Locals knew it. The terrain there squeezes and accelerates wind in ways a distant weather station will never register. A forecast built from measurements 100 miles away is a forecast about somewhere else. Federal investigators put it plainly in their recommendations. Increase the surface observation resources for the Sudwick Island and Chicknick Bay region, because the National Weather Service cannot accurately predict local conditions there with what exists now. They found a second gap that is harder to forgive. Forecasters had built a tool to predict freezing spray, a website run by the Ocean Prediction Center. It was not fully operational. Investigators recommended making it operational and actually promoting it to the fishing fleet, so captains could see the icing risk before they sailed, instead of learning it from their own rails. The head of the investigating board said something that families still repeat. That boat did not sink because the crew failed at their jobs, or because it was badly maintained. It sank because the captain had only partial access to the information he needed, and what he did have was inaccurate. Now flip that around and look at it from a cockpit. A mayday arrives from a hole in the observation network. The crew has a forecast that describes a gale. They launch. They fly for over an hour toward a spot where the real conditions are unmeasured, unmodeled, and unknown to every computer on Earth. They find out what the weather is when they arrive. That is the part pilots talk about quietly. Not the danger they can see, the danger nobody wrote down. And the observation gap is only the first information failure of a bad night. There's a second one, and it is worse because it does not just leave you blind. It sends you confidently to the wrong place. The one piece of technology that is supposed to save you is a plastic box the size of a water bottle, and it fails more often than anyone wants to admit. It is called an emergency beacon. Fishermen call it an EPIRB. It lives in a bracket on the outside of the boat, and it is built to be dumb on purpose. If the boat sinks, water pressure pops it loose, it floats up, it switches itself on. It starts shouting a distress signal and a position at a satellite passing overhead. That is the promise. A boat can die in 4 minutes with nobody able to reach a radio, and this box still tells the world where the bodies are. On the destination, it worked. That beacon is the only reason anyone knew where to look. On the Scandies Rose, it did not. She had one aboard. After she capsized, no signal was ever received. Neither survivor remembered seeing it while they were being swept off the deck. Somewhere in that violent, rolling, ice-loaded mess, the box that was supposed to speak for 7 men stayed silent. So a boat can carry the right equipment, maintained, mounted, legal, and still vanish without a whisper. Now here's the part that should bother you more. A beacon belongs to the boat. It does not belong to you. When the Scandies Rose rolled, 2 men went into the water instantly. They were not in a raft. They were not near the beacon. They were floating in the dark in survival suits, alive, with no way to tell anyone where they were. There is a fix for this, and it already exists. It is called a personal locator beacon, a handheld version that works like an EPIRB and clips to your own chest. It goes where you go. If you are in the water, it is in the water with you, screaming your position at the sky. Nobody on the Scandies Rose had one. Regulations did not require them for commercial fishing crews. That fight has been going for years. After a cargo ship called the El Faro was lost in 2015, federal investigators recommended personal beacons for commercial crews. The Coast Guard pushed back in 2018, saying the devices did not pinpoint a location accurately enough to be worth it. Investigators disagreed and said so publicly, and after the Scandies Rose, They demanded it again. Think about what is being argued over. A device that costs less than a phone against the alternative, which is a helicopter crew searching an ocean by eye. And beacons can lie in a third way, which is the cruelest of all. During the Scandies Rose search, investigators mapped out a second rescue helicopter search area and had to label it with an ugly phrase. Based off position passed in error. A wrong position does not slow a rescue down. It aims it. A crew flies at full speed, burning the fuel that decides everything and searches hard and searches well, in the wrong box of ocean, while the people they came for float somewhere else. They are not lost. They are perfectly, confidently found, just in a place where nothing is, and even a correct position starts rotting the second it is sent. Because the people in the water do not stay where the beacon said. The ocean has already started carrying them away. The moment a man hits the water, the map goes out of date. He starts moving. Wind pushes his head and shoulders. Waves shove him. Currents underneath drag him in a different direction entirely. In a place with 60-mile-an-hour wind, a floating person can travel miles in an hour without doing a single thing. Search planners deal with this by drawing a circle around the last known position and growing it with time. That circle is not a guess. It is math built from wind, current, tide, and how much of a person sticks out of the water. Here's the horror of it. The circle expands faster than the helicopter approaches. Every minute the crew spends flying toward the scene, the search area gets bigger, so the very act of traveling makes the problem harder. You're chasing a target that spreads out as you get closer. Run the numbers on a real case. A mayday comes from 800 miles away. The helicopter takes hours to arrive. By the time it does, survivors could be scattered across miles of open ocean in every direction. Now try to find them. You are looking for an orange hood, roughly the size of a basketball, in a black ocean, from 100 feet up at night, through snow, in wind that will not let you hold a steady heading. The waves are 15 to 20 feet, so every person you are hunting spends most of their time hidden in a trough behind a wall of water. They appear for a second at the crest, then vanish. This is why the little light matters so much. A strobe clipped to a survival suit is one of the only things in this entire story that reliably works. A pinprick of light, blinking, is visible from far away in total darkness. It turns a basketball into a lighthouse. Then the sea attacks the searchers too. During the Scandies Rose search, the crew of a Coast Guard cutter named the Melon spent the afternoon breaking ice off their own ship. That is what a rescue looks like in the Bering Sea. You're hunting for missing men while swinging hammers to keep your own vessel from becoming the next casualty. And the clock keeps running. 1, 10, 1. Cold shock. 10 minutes of usable hands. About an hour to unconsciousness. 2 hours in a perfect suit if you're lucky. Set those numbers next to a search area that measures in square miles, and you understand why rescue crews do not talk about hope. They talk about probability. Where is the highest chance of finding a person, given the drift, given the time, given the fuel? They fly the highest probability box first, because that is all math allows. Every choice cuts some out. Now hold all of that in your head and add one thing. Not 2 people in the water, not 7, 47. 47 people in the middle of the Bering Sea, at 3 in the morning, 800 miles from the nearest helicopter. That is the call that came in on Easter morning, 2008, and when the operator asked how many souls were aboard, there was a long pause filled with static before the answer came back. At 2:52 in the morning on Easter Sunday, a radio operator in Kodiak heard a voice say Mayday 3 times, then the position, then the problem. The vessel was flooding, taking on water in the rudder room. The boat was the Alaska Ranger, 189 feet of factory trawler, built in 1973 as an oil field service vessel and later converted to catch and process fish. She had left Dutch Harbor the day before, heading for a fishing ground 500 miles farther west. Her position was almost 800 miles west of Kodiak. The operator asked the question that matters more than any other. Number of persons on board. Static. A pause. Then the answer came through clearly. 47 people in the dark in the middle of the Bering Sea. The air temperature and wind combined to a chill around 24 degrees below zero. Snow squalls. 15-foot seas. 30 knot winds. Water at 35 degrees. It had started about an hour earlier. An alarm sounded and crew went below to find water rising fast in the stern compartments. Investigators later determined the triggering event was the loss of one of her 2 rudders. Losing a rudder leaves a hole where the rudder shaft passed through the hull. A 9-inch opening straight into the boat, and the ocean does not need to be invited twice. In the wheelhouse was Eric Peter Jacobson, 65 years old, a 3rd-generation sea captain from Massachusetts who had worked Alaskan boats for more than 30 years. Now watch the machine wake up. South of the Pribilof Islands, near the edge of the sea ice, A Coast Guard cutter called the Monroe was on patrol. Her captain, Craig Lloyd, made a decision most people never get to make. The Monroe carried standard diesel engines for normal work, and a second set of gas turbines for emergencies, engines related to the ones that push a Boeing 707 down a runway. He ordered the switch. 18,000 horsepower lit off, and men in bunks were jolted awake by the sound of their own ship deciding to sprint. 378 feet of steel began running at nearly 35 miles an hour toward a sinking boat. Meanwhile, a Jayhawk was launching, and on the Alaska Ranger, 47 people were pulling on suits in a room that was tilting. David Holt dragged his oversized suit over the sweats he had been sleeping in and felt his socks soaked through. Understand the geometry here. The helicopter is coming. The cutter is coming. Neither will be there for a long time. The nearest real help is the Alaska Warrior, her sister ship, and she is miles away in the same weather. 47 people had to survive the gap, and then the boat did something nobody expected, something that would decide who lived. She started moving backward. The Alaska Ranger was sinking, and her engines never stopped. Somewhere in the chaos, the vessel began driving astern, backing up. A 189-foot ship, flooding in the dark, reversing across the ocean while her crew tried to get off her. Investigators later called this out as the single thing that turned a bad sinking into a deadly one. Here is why. To escape a sinking ship, you use life rafts. They inflate, they float alongside, and you climb in. The Alaska Ranger carried 3 of them. A ship moving backward drags everything alongside it forward relative to the hull. So as the crew launched rafts and jumped, the ship pulled away and swung the rafts out of reach. 2 of the 3 ended up separated from the ship entirely. 25 people never reached a raft at all. More than half the crew. They went into 35-degree water with nothing but a suit and a strobe. That is the whole disaster in one sentence. The boat took the lifeboats with it. Why did nobody shut the engines down? There's an emergency shut-off for exactly this. The Coast Guard had tested that system a year before and reported it working correctly. The answer is buried with the man who would know. The captain died in the sinking. Nobody can say why the engines kept running. The flooding had help. Years later, on the 10th anniversary, an assistant engineer named Rodney Lundy spoke publicly about something he says he watched happen 2 days before the sinking. Crew had stacked bundles of netting around one of the engine room air vents. Those vents are meant to be sealed shut if the main deck floods, keeping the engine room dry and the ship alive. With gear piled around it, Lundy says that vent could not be closed. He says he argued about it. The conversation got heated. The gear stayed. When the water came, he says he could not seal that vent and the sea poured straight down it into the engine room. Lundy testified twice under oath in 2008 and left that out. He says 2 company officials at different times told him to keep quiet about it, and he did. The company's attorney later said there was no point reopening the fight. One of the officials Lundy named denied ever asking him to hold back. Whatever the truth is, the result was the same. Ryan Schuck had jumped from the middle of the ship. The current sucked him under and past his raft, and when he came up he was farther downwind than anyone. He turned and looked back. He could see tiny beacons flickering among the waves. Behind them, lit by the moon, the outline of the trawler bulging up out of the water. The bow rose toward the sky. For a moment, the lights in the wheelhouse flickered back on, one last time. Then, in seconds, she was gone. Schuck floated alone with a suit, a light, and no raft. Somewhere north of him, a helicopter was coming. What its crew saw when they arrived stopped every one of them cold. The Jayhawk crew came in low over black water, and what they found was a line of blinking lights stretching a full mile. Each light was a person. Sit with that image, because the pilots never stopped talking about it. Not a cluster, not a boat. A string of tiny strobes scattered across a mile of ocean, rising and disappearing as the waves swallowed them. Every single one of them a man in a suit deciding whether to keep going. Captain Craig Lloyd, watching from the Monroe, described it the same way. People strung out in their survival suits over a range of about a mile. The crew had known this was real for a while. On approach, the co-pilot had gotten someone on the ship on the radio before she went under. He later said the fear in that voice filled the aircraft, and it landed on all of them at once. Whatever was waiting out there was as bad as it sounded. The voice said 7 people were still aboard, getting ready for the rafts. Now look at the conditions the crew is flying in. Wind chill around 24 below. Snow squalls, meaning visibility snaps to nothing without warning. 15-foot seas, 30 knot winds. They are hovering a helicopter over water at night. There is no horizon. Below them, the surface is moving in 3 directions at once. Above them, snow. Around them, wind trying to push a 15,000-pound aircraft sideways. Helicopter pilots have a phrase for hovering with no visual reference. It is the hardest thing they do. And this was the version with everything wrong at the same time. Then comes the decision that defines the whole night. There are people in rafts, and there are people in bare water. The rafts are miserable. One had taken a foot of water aboard, and its pump had failed. The survival pack had been torn open, so the rations and flares were soaked. Nobody in it had a radio. Half the people inside were violently seasick. Among them was Gwen Rains, a biologist from Arkansas who had spent 2 years working as a fisheries observer. Boats that size are required by law to carry observers who make sure the fishing follows the rules. She was in a flooded raft with 11 strangers. Her one friend had stayed behind of the sinking ship. She had a beacon her employer had given her, and no way to know if it was working. That is the good option. The crew radioed a raft, got confirmation that those people were alive, and made the call. They would start with the men in the water, because a raft, even a bad raft, is a delay. Bare water is a countdown. So the helicopter moved to the first light. A man alone, in the dark, in a suit with no raft. It was shock. And now a man in a dry suit had to step out the door of a helicopter into that, on a wire, with nothing under him but the Bering Sea. The rescue swimmer's name was O'Brien Hollow, and his job was to voluntarily get into the water everyone else was dying in. Look at what he wore, because every piece of it is a compromise. A Nomex dry suit to hold heat. Neoprene gloves, 7mm thick, about the thickness of a stack of 3/4. A neoprene hood under his helmet, a mask with a light built into it, a snorkel, fins. Every item that keeps him alive also makes him clumsier. Thick gloves are warm hands and useless fingers. Fins let you swim and turn walking into stumbling. This is the trait the whole job runs on. He clipped his harness to a cable controlled by a hoist bolted to the airframe. Then he stepped to the open door. Below him, darkness, snow, and a moving ocean. He went down on a thin metal line, spinning slightly, dropping toward one blinking light. Shock saw him coming and did what every drowning human does. He started swimming toward his rescuer. Hollow told him to stop. That sounds cruel. It is the opposite. A swimmer coming down a wire in high wind is a pendulum. He cannot steer. If the survivor moves, they can collide or drift apart, or the wire can foul. The wind was already carrying Hollow sideways, and it carried him right onto Shock the moment he hit the water waist deep. Then Hollow grabbed his arm. Shock said later he could feel how strong the man was, and something in him let go. Hours of fighting the ocean alone, and then a hand. Hollow asked him to keep his arms tight against his sides. Here's the choice being made in that second. There are 2 ways to lift a person. A harness wraps around your chest and is faster for one person. A basket is a high-walled metal box you sit in. There's no strap in the basket. You simply sit, and the box goes up. The basket wins when there are many people, because the swimmer stays in the water and preps the next man while the box travels. It becomes an assembly line. So that is what they built in 20-foot seas in the dark. The flight mechanic lowered Hollow again. Hollow put a man in the box, up went the box, down came the box. Another man. Then they moved to the next light, and the next. Think about what the swimmer is doing physically. He is swimming in 35-degree water, wrestling grown men who are panicking and hypothermic and wearing waterlogged suits that weigh 100 pounds, while a helicopter hovers overhead blasting downwash into his face and the waves keep filling his mask. He did it again. And again. In less than an hour, they had a dozen men aboard, piled on top of each other in soaked, oversized suits. A dozen. And that was the exact moment the aircraft ran out of room. The helicopter was full, and the ocean was not empty. 12 men in waterlogged survival suits were stacked in a cabin never designed to hold them. Every one of those suits was carrying gallons of seawater. The aircraft was heavy, iced, and burning fuel faster because of it. The pilot had to make the call. No more. Now find somewhere to put them. Option 1. The Monroe. She had fuel and trained medical people aboard, which is exactly what a dozen hypothermic men need. She was 75 miles north. Option 2. The Alaska Warrior, the Ranger's sister ship, less than 10 miles away. 75 miles against 10. The math answers itself, and the math is not kind. The people still in the water do not have 75 miles of time. This is the piece nobody puts in movies. The heroic part is not the hoist. The heroic part is being the person who decides which good option to abandon. And the Alaska Warrior was doing more than waiting. Her crew was actively pulling men out of the sea themselves. In the final count, 42 of the 47 survived, and the Coast Guard and the crew of that fishing boat did it together. Fishermen saved fishermen. Meanwhile, the smaller helicopter was arriving. The Monroe carried a Dolphin, a compact helicopter with less range and less room than the Jayhawk. Its crew launched knowing something ugly. Every minute they spent hovering was fuel they needed for the trip back. The clock started the moment they lifted off. The rescue swimmer was Abram Heller. He went down into water that had now been working on these men for hours, and the difference was obvious. These fishermen were colder than the ones the Jayhawk had lifted an hour earlier. Colder means slower. Slower means fighting. The fourth man took him at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes of a hypothermic swimmer trying to calm a terrified, burly fisherman enough to sit in a metal box, while the aircraft above burned through its own survival. Heller got 5 men up. Then the Dolphin was out of room, and Heller made a choice that says everything about this job. He stayed in the water. The helicopter was small. His body took up a seat. A seat is a person. So the swimmer, in 35-degree water, waved his own ride away and floated there in the dark to make room for someone else. That is not a story about courage. That is a story about arithmetic, and a man who did the arithmetic honestly. Now stack the situation. The Dolphin is full and low on fuel and cannot take its own swimmer. The Jayhawk is full and needs to unload. Men are still in the water. The Monroe is 75 miles away with the only real fuel supply. There was one way out of this, and it was insane. The Jayhawk was going to refuel while flying at night, in 20-foot seas, by lowering a hook to a ship that would not stop moving. They had practiced it exactly once, in daylight, in calm weather. To refuel a helicopter without landing it, you hover next to a ship in the dark and go fishing for a hose. The maneuver has a name, helicopter in flight refueling. Crews call it high FR, and it exists because sometimes the only fuel for hundreds of miles is on a boat, too small to land on. Here is how it works, and it sounds like a dam. The cutter lays a fuel hose out along her deck. The helicopter hovers overhead and lowers its rescue hoist hook, the same hook that lifts people. The deck crew hangs the hose on the hook. The helicopter winches the hose up into its own cabin. Then it slides about 30 feet off the side of the ship and hovers there, tethered to the boat by a live fuel line, pumping jet fuel while both machines move independently. Now add every real condition from that night. The ship is not still. She is a 378-foot cutter riding 15-foot seas, which means her deck is climbing and dropping the height of a house, over and over while rolling. The helicopter has to hold position relative to a target that will not hold still. It is dark, snow is blowing through, wind chill is around 24 below, there is no horizon, and the pilot is doing it while a dozen soaked fishermen sit in the back, some of them barely conscious. The Jayhawk crew had practiced this maneuver with the Monroe's crew days before the sinking. That is genuine luck, and it is why anyone lived. The exercise had been in daylight, in relatively calm conditions. They were now doing the night version, improvised, cold, with the fuel gauge deciding who gets saved. It was working. The Jayhawk's tanks hold about 6,460 pounds of fuel, and they were more than 2/3 of the way there. Then the radio call came from the Dolphin. The little helicopter was dangerously short, 20 minutes from the cutter, with only 36 minutes to splash. Splash is exactly what it sounds like. 36 minutes until the engines stop and the aircraft becomes a rock. That is a 14-minute margin. 14 minutes between 4 Coast Guardsmen and the same water they had been pulling people out of all night. And they were carrying 5 rescued fishermen who had already survived one sinking. So the Jayhawk cut its own fuel line short and cleared out of the way, because the Dolphin needed the deck immediately. Read that again. They stopped filling their own tanks in the middle of an ocean at night, hundreds of miles from land, to let someone else live. The Jayhawk left with its tanks about 2/3 full instead of full. Then it turned around and went back out and picked up 5 more men, including Heller, the Dolphin swimmer, still floating out there where he had chosen to stay. Everything was working. Barely, on the edge, but working. 42 people were coming home. And then, hanging in a basket 30 feet above the water, one man decided to stand up. The rescue basket was more than 30 feet above the water when the man inside it started to climb out. He was one of the fishermen the Dolphin crew was lifting. Abram Heller had spent at least 10 minutes in the water with him, calming him down, getting him seated inside the high-walled box. From the surface, it finally looked right. Heller signaled. The flight mechanic, Musgrave, started the hoist. Then, as the basket rose toward the helicopter, the man lifted himself onto the rail. His legs came out over the side. His body went stiff. He clung to the metal triangle at the top of the basket, hanging on the outside of the thing built to save him, terrified, 30 feet over the Bering Sea. Nobody knows exactly what went through his head. Hypothermia does this. When your core cools, your thinking goes with it. Judgment leaves before consciousness does. Men in that state have tried to swim away from helicopters. This is why swimmers strap people down when there's time, and why there is no strap in the basket when there's not. Musgrave was stuck. With the survivor halfway out, he could not pull the basket inside the door. So the aircraft hovered there, burning fuel it did not have with a man dangling in its downwash. He fell. more than 30 feet back into the water he had just been pulled out of, and the helicopter could not go get him. Read that plainly. It was nearly out of fuel. The Dolphin was already counting minutes to splash. Turning around meant 4 Coast Guardsmen and 5 rescued fishermen went into the water with him, and then there would be 10 people to find instead of 1. They had to leave. At the time, nobody knew if he survived. The reports that week said it was unclear. He did not. Later accounts confirmed that a man died after slipping from the Dolphin's basket and falling back into the sea. One of the 5 who did not come home. Sit with the shape of that for a second. He was found. He was reached. A swimmer got to him in the middle of the Bering Sea, in the dark, in 35-degree water. He was placed in the basket. He was lifted off the ocean, and he still died. That is the fact that separates this place from every dramatic rescue you have ever watched. Arriving is not saving. Reaching someone is not saving them. The cold keeps working the entire time, and it works on the brain first, so the person you're rescuing may fight you, may panic, may undo everything you did. The crews carry that. It was not a mistake by the swimmer, or the mechanic, or the pilots. Every one of them did the job correctly, and a man still fell. By the end of that morning, 42 people had been pulled out of the Bering Sea. The Coast Guard would call it the largest cold water rescue in its history. 5 were gone. 4 bodies were eventually recovered. 1 man was still missing. And here the story does something that still makes people angry, 17 years later. The Coast Guard stopped looking for him, not out of exhaustion, not out of cruelty, because somebody had told them a number, and the number was wrong. The rescue ended because the math said everyone was accounted for, and the math was built on bad information. The Coast Guard had been given the wrong count of how many people were aboard the Alaska Ranger, so as survivors were tallied on the Monroe and the Alaska Warrior. The numbers eventually matched. Everybody was either rescued or recovered. They secured the search, then someone realized 1 crew member was still unaccounted for. They reinstated it. Aircraft went back up. The Monroe began methodically working the ocean again, grid by grid. The rescued men stayed camped aboard the cutter, refusing to be taken to shore while a shipmate was still out there. Ryan Schuck was among them. He had heard some men did not make it. He did not know which ones. The search ran until Monday evening, March 24th, and then it stopped for good. That last body was never recovered. Understand what a gap like that costs. Every hour of searching in the Bering Sea is fuel, crews, and daylight, and all 3 are finite. The hours spent standing down were hours the ocean used to spread a person across miles of water. By the time the aircraft were back up, the drift circle had grown into something no fleet could cover. The 5 who died were Eric Peder Jacobsen, the captain, Daniel Cook, the chief engineer, David Silvera, the mate, Byron Carrillo, a crewman, and Satoshi Kono, the fishmaster. 3 of them died of exposure, cold, in the water, waiting. Jacobsen stayed at the helm. A crewman named Hagerman saw him for the last time as he went overboard, alone in the wheelhouse, still on the radio with the Coast Guard, still trying to reach help for his crew. His last words to Hagerman were to get off the boat and get to a raft. He was the only one left up there. His daughter Karen said afterward that it did not surprise her at all. He had always said he would go down with his ship if that was what it took to make sure everyone was safe. He was 65 years old. He had run boats in Alaska for over 30 years. He was buried in Seattle that week. Hagerman survived. He described watching waves climb higher and higher up the stern in the dark after the power died, and knowing, in a way you cannot argue with, that the boat was not going to stop sinking. Later, floating in the water, choking on diesel that had spilled from the wreck, growing colder, he made his peace with God. About 10 minutes after that, he saw the helicopter. He called it the best feeling he ever had in his life. The following year, an aviation magazine gave its Heroism Award to the Coast Guard crews from that night. The citation lists the conditions like a shopping list: snow squalls, 24 below wind chill, 15-foot seas, 30-knot winds. Then it uses the word airmanship, which is the most understated compliment in aviation. 42 people, the largest cold water rescue in the history of the service, and every crew in Kodiak knows the truth underneath the award. The helicopters got there, the swimmers got in, the cutter sprinted, everything worked. 5 people still died. That is the good day. 4 years earlier, in the same waters, the Coast Guard had a worse one. That night, the ocean did not just take the fishermen. It reached up and took a helicopter. The rescue basket was throwing blue lightning at the ship, and the sailors would not touch it. This is December of 2004. The ship is the Selendang Ayu, a 738-foot bulk carrier hauling 66,000 tons of soybeans from Seattle to China, plus about 1,000 tons of fuel oil. 26 men aboard, commanded by a 52-year-old Indian captain named Kailash Singh. On December 6th, about 100 miles from Dutch Harbor, her engine died. Cracked piston rings. The engineers isolated the bad cylinder and tried to restart. Nothing. They found more damage. They worked through the night and the engine stayed dead. So a ship the length of 2 football fields began drifting toward Unalaska Island with no way to stop. Everything that could be tried was tried. A Coast Guard cutter, the Alex Haley, came out to tow. A commercial tug arrived, then a second tug. The weather kept tearing the tow lines apart. On the morning of December 8th, the last line parted and the wind made it impossible to reconnect. The ship dropped anchor. It held for about an hour. Then the wind won and she started moving again. The other anchor could not be lowered because the first anchor chain had wrapped around her bow. They were out of options. 2 Jayhawks had been staged forward at Cold Bay for exactly this. They flew out and started lifting men off. Even the easy part was ugly. The first crews to be hoisted came up with their suitcases, sailors from the Philippines and India and China, most of whom had never seen weather like this, being asked to dangle on a wire into a howling winter storm, off a ship that was not yet sinking. Several were disorganized and panicked, and not remotely convinced this was a good idea. By 3 in the afternoon, the 2 helicopters had each taken 9 men. One lowered its 9 onto the Alex Haley, hovering above her deck while she bucked in the seas. The other flew its group to a rendezvous point on the island, handed them over, then flew to Cold Bay and broke down. 1 helicopter left. The remaining Jayhawk flew to Dutch Harbor, unloaded, refueled, and went back for the last 8. Then the ship ran aground on a reef at Scan Bay, 1,000 feet from the breakers, and started taking water. The captain requested immediate evacuation of everyone left. The Jayhawk came in over the bow. The co-pilot held the hover. The flight mechanic, Brian Lickfield, started lowering the basket, and the storm did something strange. Static electricity, built up by the spinning rotors, began arcing off the basket in blue bolts, jumping to the ship's steel. Imagine being told to climb into a metal box that is shooting lightning at your feet. They refused. So the rescue swimmer, Aaron Bean, went down on the wire to sort it out himself. He landed on the deck of a grounded, flooding freighter and started gesturing, cajoling, tossing suitcases aside, physically putting men into the basket one at a time. He had just loaded the 7th man when the pilot, Dave Neal, looked out into the darkness and saw something coming. It was a wave larger than any wave he had ever seen in his life. Dave Neal took the controls from his co-pilot and pulled the helicopter straight up as hard as it would go. He got about 100 feet above the ship's deck cranes. Lickfield had just dragged the 7th sailor through the door into the cabin. Then the wave hit the side of the freighter. Here's the physics, and it is the shallow water trick from the beginning of the story, arriving at its logical end. The wave slammed into 738 feet of steel hull. All that horizontal energy hit a wall and had nowhere to go except straight up. The ocean turned a sideways punch into a vertical column of water and threw it 100 feet into the air. It engulfed his helicopter. The windshield went white with seafoam. Lickfield hollered that there was water in the cabin. Up, up, up. But a jet engine breathed air. Fill its intakes with seawater and it stops being an engine. Both of them flamed out. Alarms, red lights, and a sound the crew would not forget. The whine of the turbines spooling down like a train whistle fading into the distance. The co-pilot pushed the nose down. The instinct that saves you in a helicopter, trading altitude for airspeed to fly out of trouble. Well, there was no power to fly anywhere. The helicopter fell. Physics finished it. With the engines dead, the torque holding the airframe straight vanished, so the main rotor spun the whole aircraft counterclockwise like a top. The tail whipped around and slammed into the side of the ship. The main rotor blades followed and shattered against the ship's rail. On the deck below, Aaron Bean and Captain Singh, the last 2 men aboard, crouched as pieces of steel ricocheted around them. Then the helicopter hit the water and sank. Understand what has just happened. This was a rescue. Coast Guard crews had already lifted 18 men to safety. They were on the last load. 7 sailors were in that cabin. 3 Coast Guardsmen were flying it. And now all 10 of them were in the December ocean of the Aleutians in the dark, in a storm bad enough to break the tow lines of 2 tugs. Understand also what did not happen. Nobody made a mistake. The pilot saw the wave and reacted correctly. The mechanic had the man aboard. The co-pilot flew the right escape. The rescue was going well. The sea simply reached up and took the helicopter out of the sky. That is what pilots mean when they say this place still terrifies them. Skill is not a shield. Experience is not a shield. Lickfield had flown for 16 years and said afterward that those were the worst conditions he had ever seen. Neal had never seen a wave like that in his career. The aircraft was upside down and filling, and inside it, in total darkness, a man's right hand went to the exact spot on his harness it had gone to for 17 years. Brian Lickfield had buckled his harness the same way for 17 years, and it took him about 3 seconds to explain why. The Coast Guard does not care which way a flight mechanic puts on a gunner's belt. There is no rule. Left side, right side, personal preference. Lickfield always put his on the same way, every flight, for 17 years, for one reason. He wanted the release to be in the same place every single time, so that one day, if the moment ever came, his hand would find it without asking his brain first. The moment came. The fuselage rolled over, the cabin filled with water. It was night, in December, in the Aleutians, and he was upside down inside a machine sinking into the Bering Sea. Human beings drown in wrecks like this for a boring reason. Disorientation. Upside down and underwater in the dark, you do not know which way is up, and you cannot find a buckle you have to hunt for. People die with their hands searching. Lickfield grabbed the edge of the door with one hand. The other hit the release on the right side of the belt, the same spot it had touched thousands of times. He pulled himself through the door and swam for the surface. He would tell an interviewer later, in the flat way these people talk, that you never really think you're going to crash a helicopter, but you had better hope it is a real crash, because if so, he is leaving. Neil and the co-pilot got out of the cockpit and surfaced too. Now the second helicopter. The Alex Haley had launched her own small Dolphin, number 6513, in sea and wind conditions far outside what the Coast Guard normally allows anyone to fly in. She was up there as backup, which on that night meant she was the only thing between 10 men and the ocean. She found the crew in the water and started hoisting. She got 3 Coast Guardsmen. She got 1 sailor from the Freya, a man who came up with the hoist cable wrapped around his neck, unconscious but alive. The other 6 sailors were never found. 6 men, hoisted off a sinking ship, aboard a rescue helicopter, and then dead in the water minutes later. They had already been saved. Twice, in a sense. And they died anyway. The Dolphin flew the survivors to Dutch Harbor. On the tarmac that night, walking away from the aircraft that had pulled him out of the sea, Lickfield looked at the number painted on its side, 6513. It was the same airframe he had qualified in as a flight mechanic back in 1992. Rebuilt at least once since, the same helicopter. Somewhere across town, a salvage operator named Dan McGone stepped out of a different helicopter and his son pulled over in a welding truck and hugged him, hard, which was completely out of character. McGone had left the wreck site just before the crash and had no idea yet what had happened. Out on the reef in the dark, the story was not over. 2 men were still on that ship, and the ship was about to come apart underneath them. Aaron Bean had never set foot on a ship before in his life, and now he was standing on one that was breaking in half. He had gone down that hoist wire with no rescue gear and no fins because he was only supposed to be on deck for a few minutes to load the basket. The helicopter that brought him was now on the bottom of the sea. That left 2 men on the bow of the Selendang Ayu. Bean and Captain Kailash Singh, the last of his crew, the man who had stayed until everyone else was off. They were on a grounded freighter on a reef in a blizzard at night, with waves breaking over them. Bean got to work. He fought with the line to a life raft, trying to get it usable for what turned into hours. The line frayed and finally broke. The water around them was now a chemical soup. Jet fuel from the crashed helicopter and heavy fuel oil from the ship's ruptured tanks, mixing in the surf and blowing back over the deck. Bean spent hours being showered in it. Then, about 2 hours in, there was a deafening crack. The ship was splitting. The stern began to drift away, tilting off at a 35-degree angle. The bow, where Bean and Singh were standing, stayed jammed on the shoals, being crushed by the reef going dark. Just after 7 at night, the Selendang Ayu came apart completely, with the 2 of them still on the bow. Bean, without rescue gear, in the dark, clutched the captain with one arm and some exposed pipes with the other, and held on. He held on for nearly 4 hours total. At 8:30, the Dolphin came back. Getting them off was its own nightmare. The pilots had to hover over a broken bow in a blizzard, and the wind was so strong that the flight mechanic had to pay out 175 feet of hoist cable, with the basket blowing sideways the whole way down like a kite. They got both men. 2 crewmen from that Dolphin were later decorated. Aaron Bean's devotion to duty earned him a medal. Over the following weeks, the ship broke up entirely, spilling soybeans and hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel oil across the shore of Unalaska, triggering a cleanup that ran into 2006. The Coast Guard searched for the 6 missing sailors until December 10th and then stopped. The surviving crew went home to India, the Philippines, and China. The Coast Guard people who rescued them went back to work. Those who study this operation call it one of the most logistically complicated rescues the service has ever attempted. Here's what a local fisherman said about it years later, and it is the line that should stay with you. He listed off other wrecks in those same waters, then said that if you count near misses, you can easily call one a year, right there in local waters. It is barely outside the box. Barely outside the box. So the obvious question sits there, and it has sat there since 2004. Why does anyone still get in the helicopter? Ask a Kodiak crew why they go, and they will not give you a speech. They will start talking about hangar space. That is the tell. These people do not think about courage. They think about logistics because logistics is the thing they can actually control. Look at what changed after all this, because things did change. After the destination, the fleet reacted. Around 50 boats volunteered for stability safety checks, the same 15-minute check that her captain declined. That next winter crab season, nobody died. Coast Guard officials said the crabbers took it to heart. Investigators pushed hard on the rulebook. They demanded stability instructions that actually account for ice on crab pots and pot stacks, instead of pretending a mesh cage collects ice like a flat deck. They demanded better weather observation around the places that kill people, so a forecast is not a guess made from 100 miles away. They demanded that the freezing spray forecasting tool be made fully operational and actually put in front of captains. And they demanded the small thing that keeps getting refused: a personal beacon on every crew member so that a man swept off a deck can call for himself. That fight is still going. The Coast Guard said the technology was not accurate enough. Investigators said that was wrong and kept saying it. 2 men floated in a raft off Sudwick Island for hours with no way to tell anyone where they were, and that argument continues in offices thousands of miles from the water. Meanwhile, the fleet is still largely uninspected. Boats up to 79 feet long still have no real standards for stability and watertight integrity. Many crews get no formal training in how their own boat stays upright, and investigators keep finding vessels without working locator gear. So the crews at Kodiak show up. 6 Jayhawks, 4 Dolphins, 5 Hercules, 4 million square miles. Ask them what they fear, and they will not say the ocean. The ocean is a known quantity. They fear the day the aircraft is at the ring of its range, at the edge of its fuel, with people in the water who need one more hoist. Because everything in this story comes back to distance. Not one person out here died from a lack of will. The swimmers got in, the pilots hovered. Heller stayed in the water so a stranger could have his seat. Lickfield swam out of a sinking helicopter and went back to work. Bean stood on a splitting bow for 4 hours to hold a captain he had just met. The limit was never people. The limit was miles, minutes, and gallons, which is why the crews at Kodiak are watching something right now that scares them more than any storm in this entire story. It has nothing to do with weather. It has to do with a line on a map that has been moving north for years. Sea ice used to sit like a wall across the northern Bering Sea, and it is disappearing. 2018 and 2019 saw record low ice. The ice is not what kept the fishermen safe, but it is what kept them close. The ice edge is retreating north, the fish are following it, the boats are following the fish, and the helicopters cannot follow anybody. Here's the chain, and every link is already happening. Sea ice covers the northern Bering Sea from November through May. In hard winters, it reaches all the way down past the Pribilov Islands. That ice is a wall. Boats do not fish inside it, so the ice set the northern boundary of the entire industry. Now, the wall is failing. Ice extent has dropped sharply, with record lows in 2018 and 2019. Warming water is pushing fish species northward, scrambling patterns that fishermen and scientists relied on for generations. So the fleet moves north. It already has. That is why the Coast Guard had to reopen St. Paul mid-season in 2019, after 5 years of it sitting empty. The fleet had shifted, and their coverage no longer covered anything. Read that as what it is. The rescue map is being redrawn by the climate, and the Coast Guard is chasing it with cargo planes full of spare parts, asking strangers in tiny towns for hangar space. Now do the arithmetic one last time. The Jayhawk rescues to about 225 miles. That number is not negotiable, because it is fuel, not courage. As the fleet moves north, the distance from every existing base grows. There's no runway waiting up there. There's no Cold Bay, no St. Paul, no hangar, no fuel truck, no medical clinic. Meanwhile, the water stays exactly as cold as it has always been. 1-10-1. Cold shock, 10 minutes of hands, an hour to unconsciousness, 2 hours in a perfect suit if you are lucky, and almost nobody gets the perfect suit. The clock does not move north, only the boats do, and the storms are coming with them. In January of 2026, satellites measured seas over 40 feet south of the Aleutians. In April of 2026, forecasters watched a hurricane-force low park itself over the western islands and refused to leave. That is not history. That is this year. Which brings this all the way back to where it started. On January 5th, 2026, 9 men stood on the deck of the Arctic Sea for about 7 hours in 50-knot wind while a boat came apart underneath them, waiting for a helicopter that had to fly in from Cold Bay. They lived. It barely made the news. That is the version where everything works. Somewhere out there tonight, boats are running for the grounds with pots stacked 5 high. In the dark, in February, with a delivery date and a quota and a loan, spray is freezing on the rails at an inch an hour. Somebody is standing in the bridge, looking through the only 2 windows with heaters, guessing. And at Kodiak, 6 Jayhawks sit in a hangar guarding 4 million square miles. The pilots are not afraid of the Bering Sea because of what it did in 2004 or 2008 or 2017. They are afraid of it because none of that has been fixed. The water is still 35 degrees, the shelf is still shallow, the Aleutian low is still spinning, the beacons still fail, the forecasts still have holes 100 miles wide, and the fleet is moving farther out of reach every year. The next Mayday is already on its way. Nobody knows the date. The only thing anyone knows for certain is that when it comes, somebody in Kodiak will get out of a chair, walk to a helicopter, and go anyway.